within. There's a freedom without. Try to catch the lurch in a paper cup. There's a battle ahead. Many battles are lost, but you never see the end of the road while you're traveling with me. And now, hey now, don't dream it's over. Hey now, when the world comes in, they come to build a wall between us. We know they won't win. I will tell in my car. There's a hole in the roof. My possession are casting me suspicion, but there's no proof. In the paper today, there's a war and a waste, but you turn right over to the TV page. Hey now, don't dream it's over. Hey now, when the world comes in, they come to build a wall between us. We know they won't win. Now I'm walking again to the beat of a drum. Get to know the feeling of liberation and relive. Hey now, don't dream it's over. Hey now, when the world comes in, they come to build a wall between us. You know they won't win. No matter
who's joined this panel session on attacks on environmental scientists, implications for the free and responsible practice of science. Welcome to those in Panama and to those who are joining us online. This session has been organized by the International Science Council's Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. The ISC is the world's largest international grouping of organized science, with over 230 members across the natural and social sciences, including national and regional scientific organizations, academies, research councils, and the disciplinary unions and associations. The Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science, CFRS, is part of the Council's governing structure. It's the guardian of the ISC's principle of freedom and responsibility. This principle asserts that the free and responsible practice of science is fundamental to scientific advancement and human and environmental well-being. The principle sets out the freedoms that scientists should enjoy and the responsibilities they carry as practicing researchers. Such practice requires freedom of movement, association, expression, and communication for scientists, as well as equitable access to data, information, and other resources necessary for research. It requires responsibility at all levels to carry out and communicate scientific work with integrity, respect, fairness, and transparency, and importantly, recognizing its benefits and possible harms and making sure to communicate those. Now, CFRS, the committee, has two broad areas of work: projects and casework. In terms of cases, we monitor cases of scientists and research entities whose freedoms and rights are restricted as a result of carrying out their research, and offer assistance where we can. One of our projects is currently concerned with science in times of crisis, seeking to understand the impact of crises, whether they be human-induced natural disasters, conflicts, wars, a pandemic, the impact of crises on the scientific community and on science systems, and how the scientific community can mobilize to protect and support individual scientists and scientific entities. The 2023 Academic Freedom Index shows that at a country level, academic freedom has deteriorated significantly, with 50% of the world's population living in political context where a general backslide has occurred over the last decade. A 2022 survey published in Science showed that there was an outbreak of harassment towards scientists during the COVID-19 pandemic. Attacks on scientists are a recurrent phenomenon in times of crisis and very definitely rising. The BBC recently reported that these trends are accompanied by an unprecedented number of murdered environmental advocates over the last decade. So at a time when science is of paramount importance to human and environmental well-being, scientific freedom is under attack in many places. It is exactly the rights and principles related to the free and responsible practice of science that are attacked as people and groups for a variety of ideological, political, financial, and other vested interests question and seek to undermine scientific research. I leave you now in the supremely capable hands of Jorge Huete and his excellent panel of scientists to talk about threats directed towards environmental scientists. Thank you. Jorge.
Thank you very much, Vivi. Good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to welcome you to this panel session organized for the Sustainability Research and Innovation Congress 2023. The panel is hosted by the International Science Council's Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. My name is Jorge Huete. I'm a member of the Academy of Sciences of Nicaragua and a professor at Georgetown University in the US. It's a great honor for me, and I'm delighted to moderate this important session. First, let me thank Vivi for that introduction of the International Science Council Committee and the principle of freedom and responsibility in science. Whenever scientists and activists in the environmental sciences are attacked or censured, it goes against the principle and weakens the important role that science plays in society. Clearly, this is an important issue for the functioning of the global science system. But let's explore in more detail what exactly we mean when we talk about attacks on environmental scientists. In this session, we'll talk about how and why environmental scientists are attacked, what this means for the free and responsible practice of science, particularly in this time of public crisis, global crisis, and what we as this global scientific community can and should do about it. In today's world, characterized by escalating geopolitical tensions and diminishing academic and scientific liberties, environmental scientists are increasingly subjected to threats and attacks. It is crucial to recognize that such actions directly undermine the principles of academic freedom that universities strive to support and are required to protect. These obligations do go beyond protecting environmental scientists and are closely tied to opposing all forms of discrimination. Therefore, it is essential to acknowledge and address these challenges, ensuring the preservation of scientific research integrity and upholding the broader values of equality and freedom. Environmental scientists often face targeted attacks because government and industries have their own political and economic motivations. These actors may see environmental scientists as obstacles to their interests, especially when their work involves environmental risks or costly regulations. As a result, these attacks can take different forms, such as discrediting scientists, limiting funding for environmental research, manipulating scientific findings, or undermining the credibility of scientific institutions, and even threats, intimidations, and violence. Although these attacks happen worldwide, their intensity and methodology may vary in different regions. Scientists who focus on climate change, biodiversity conservation, pollution control, and natural resource management are often the most targeted because their work directly affects policies and practices that can impact the profits and operations of powerful industries. Understanding why these attacks occur and how they're carried is crucial to protect the integrity of scientific research and ensure effective environmental protection. Attacks on environmental scientists are closely connected to the broader global context of polycrisis, which makes their potential impact even more significant. By polycrisis, we mean the simultaneous and overlapping challenges the world is currently facing, such as the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis and ecological collapse, but also spiraling inequalities, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, concerns about artificial intelligence, high numbers of migrants and migration, and general uncertainty about the future. In today's geopolitical landscape, prioritizing resource extraction often takes precedence over responsible environmental stewardship. This means that short-term ecological gains are given more importance than long-term sustainability. Ignoring the warnings and expertise of environmental scientists can lead to severe humanitarian consequences, such as polluted water and soil, food shortages, droughts, collapsing fisheries, oil spills, radiation leaks, climate-related disasters, and mass displacement. Ignoring this warning can lead to severe humanitarian consequences, and these consequences not only pose immediate threats to communities and ecosystems, but also have the potential to worsen social, economic, and potential tensions, ultimately leading to future conflicts. By silencing or disregarding the advice of environmental scientists, decision makers risk perpetuating the cycle of polycrisis and hindering the necessary actions to effectively address environmental challenges. Recognizing the crucial role of environmental scientists and ensuring that their voices are heard and respected are essential for promoting sustainable practices, mitigating crises, and building a more resilient and fair global future. The reports detailing attacks on environmental scientists are deeply concerning. A 2021 report by Global Witness revealed that Latin America is the most dangerous region for environmental activists, with a shocking 227 documented fatal attacks in 2020, marking it as the deadliest year on record. The majority of these attacks took place in Latin America, accounting for 3/4 of all incidents. Notably, Colombia and Mexico had the highest number of murders, with 65 and 30 deaths respectively. The following year, 2021, a significant majority of these murders occurred in the same continent, representing 68% of the total cases. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Honduras were among the countries reporting the highest number of incidents. These statistics underscore the need or increased protection and action to ensure the safety of environmental scientists. Speaking particularly on Central America, a sub-region which faces widespread impunity and urgent action is needed to address human rights abuses there. Key concerns include the assassination of environmental defender Berta Cáceres in Honduras, an environmental and indigenous activist who was tragically killed in 2016 for her efforts to protect the Hualcarque River from the Agua Zarca hydroelectric project. The human rights concerns related to the Interoceanic Canal project in Nicaragua and the ongoing violence against indigenous communities there, where criminal groups target the Miskito and Mayangna peoples, resulting in the murder of 15 activists as part of a recent systematic campaign. The situation in Latin America is not due to a lack of laws. Countries in the region have signed international human rights agreements and prioritize human rights in their legal frameworks. Nevertheless, the difficulty lies in the effective enforcement of these laws, hindered by limitations in capacity and political determination. These agreements aim to guarantee access to environmental information, public participation in decision-making, and environmental justice. Regrettably, despite signing these agreements, there has been a significant rise in attacks on environmental activists. These attacks primarily target those who document the actions of irresponsible industries and actors such as militias, organized crime, and drug trafficking networks. The situation in Latin America highlights the urgent need for stronger implementation and protection of environmental scientists and activists. Thank you for your attention to these personal reflections. All these issues will be considered in this panel, and we now look forward to an insightful and productive discussion. We are privileged to have distinguished speakers who will share their insights on different aspects of these issues before we all come together to discuss what the global scientific community can and should do in response, with time for a Q&A session. Our first speaker is Dr. Katrin Kinzelbach, a renowned professor of international politics of human rights at the Institute of Political Science at Frederick Alexander Universitat. She studies the construction, implementation, and counteraction of human rights by various actors. She will explore the connection between these attacks on environmental researchers and activists and the principle of freedom and responsibility in science. Professor Kinzelbach's presentation will shed light on how these attacks affect the right to science and the role of science as a global public good.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me well. I'm very glad to join this panel today on an important topic. My remarks will be informed by a human rights-based approach, and in line with this perspective, I want to start by referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which will actually celebrate its 75th anniversary later this year. And the Universal Declaration refers to science in Article 27, which reads as follows. I start a quote. Everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. End of quote. Note that the declaration spells out everyone, and not just tenured professors, have the right to freely engage in scientific research. The Universal Declaration also notes that everyone has the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific advancement. This is another way of saying science ought to be a public good. Advancement and scientific knowledge ought to be accessible publicly. Interestingly, the idea of a right to science was first expressed at an international level in the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Men, which is also called the Bogota Declaration. And this was adopted a few months before the Universal Declaration was passed at the UN. Indeed, Latin American countries have had a very strong influence on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not only because they held 1/3 of the votes in the UN General Assembly at the time, but also because they contributed new ideas, such as on the right to science. And if the right to science had not made it into the regional Bogota Declaration, I believe we would very likely not have a right to science in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Now, the Bogota Declaration spoke about the right to science, but it said nothing about the freedom of science. So how did the freedom of science enter human rights doctrine? It is thanks to an initiative of the Peruvian delegate José Encinas, who did not otherwise play an important role in the negotiations on the Universal Declaration. I find it very interesting that he made his intervention in favor of freedom of science very few weeks after a military coup happened in his home country, Peru. And we know, of course, that autocratization facilitates attacks on scientists, among other members of society. Now, thanks to José Encinas, we have this idea that science ought to be free in the Universal Declaration. And this idea got further modified and developed in the 1950s and the 1960s through repeated negotiations at the UN, and eventually codified in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a binding human rights treaty by now ratified by 171 states. And these signatory states from across the world have accepted a duty to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research. So actually, and unfortunately, the term respect only means that states must refrain from interference in scientific research. Article 15.3 of this covenant does not specifically obligate states to protect scientists against interference from third parties. Human rights doctrine thankfully evolves over time, and the responsible UN treaty body tasked with interpreting this treaty issued a general comment in 2020 that elaborates on the content of Article 15. And here we can read that the freedom of science entails, first point, protection of researchers from undue influence on their independent judgment. So not only the states have to respect the freedom of science, they also have to protect researchers from undue influence. And spells out a number of different components, the possibilities for researchers to set up autonomous research institutions, that they can define the aims and objectives of their research, that they have a right to withdraw from projects if their conscience so dictates, that they have the freedom to cooperate with other researchers, nationally and internationally, and of course that they can share scientific data and analysis, not only with scholars, but also with policymakers and with the public. As is often the case when it comes to human rights, there is, of course, a difference between this de jure commitment, fairly widely shared by states, 171 of them, and the de facto situation. To better understand the de facto situation, I co-created the Academic Freedom Index, which was already mentioned, together with colleagues at the University of Gothenburg and 2,197 country experts from around the world. Together, we assess 179 countries and territories, and we do not only capture state repression, but also ask the country experts to reflect on interference by third parties, such as businesses, foundations, maybe religious groups. It could also be the public that does not tolerate specific research topics. We often see this in the field of gender studies, but for the purposes of this panel, of course, also public pressure from climate change deniers. Now, our index assesses the degree of scientific freedom across 5 dimensions: the freedom to research and teach, the freedom of academic exchange and dissemination, freedom of academic and artistic expression, institutional autonomy of research institutions, and campus integrity, so the absence of human rights violations on campus, such as forced disappearances and the like. You can go to the academicfreedomindex.net to check out our findings. We've already mentioned the index before. I do have to slightly correct our findings. At a global level, we actually found that the country-based average stagnated over the last 10 years. So there's a small decline in global average when you look at the country-based average. But this small decline is within what we call the confidence interval, so within the statistical margin of error. And this is, of course, it's a global average, so some countries decline, actually several others advance, but the large majority of countries actually stay unchanged in the last 10 years. Maybe this is a surprising message because we often hear that academic freedom is in decline globally. And I guess we have all become very used to negative news. Well, what's important to highlight here is that the country-based average is only one way of looking at the world. Another way of looking at the world is how many people are affected. And actually, when we refer to a population-weighted average, so we give more weight to countries where the population is larger, we do find a very clear downward trend. This is, by the way, also true for the regional score for Latin America. Several countries' academic freedom scores have declined over the past 10 years in the region, but Brazil and Mexico in particular pull down the population-weighted average in the region. Our academic freedom index is not disaggregated by discipline, so unfortunately I cannot provide specific information for environmental scientists. Jorge has mentioned some events-based data on murders, and we also have similar information on dismissals, for example. As a social scientist, I would caution that it's very hard to come by reliable data that is actually comparable over time and across countries. So I'm not sure what the most dangerous region in the world actually is for environmental scientists, because for that we would require truly comparable data, which we simply don't have. In most countries, we probably have a dark figure, especially so in repressive countries. So we know much fewer cases than there probably are. And we tend, with such events data, we tend to focus on hard repression, murder, right? But there are softer forms of repression that are much more difficult to observe and that can also undermine science. I believe that such soft forms of repression are very likely more widespread than hard forms of repression. There's no doubt that some scholars are more at risk than others, and it is plausible to me that environmental scholars are a high-risk group, especially in countries where they are confronted by powerful stakeholders who have an interest in undermining their research, and where the state is incapable or unwilling to provide protection. With this, I hand over to my colleagues on the panel who will have more nuance to add.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's very fascinating, all the information that you're providing regarding the Bogota Declaration, regarding the Academic Freedom Index, which would be very interesting to follow up maybe. And, one question would be how we are putting all of that into action regarding, the difficulties that it is because of declining this situation. And also, talking about the difficulties with reliable data. And I think this makes good points for a good discussion that we can follow up later. So next, we have Professor Khushil Watini, an associate professor of philosophy. Professor Watini's research focuses on ethics, politics, and indigenous philosophy, providing valuable insights into this topic. She will delve into the role of discrimination against indigenous communities in attacks on environmental scientists. Please, Dr. Watini.
Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. Everyone can hear me? Just assume that. Ngā mihi mai o hā kia koutou i tēnei wā. So greetings and acknowledgements to those in Panama and those online. I'm joining you from Tāmaki Makaurau or Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand this morning. And I'm really pleased to be part of this event. Thanks so much for the comments so far. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous communities and how the urgent need for protecting these communities intersects with the need for protecting environmental scientists, both within these communities and outside of them. So what we know is Indigenous communities are found in practically every region of the world. So roughly 400 million Indigenous people located in around 90 countries. Despite only making up 6% of the global population, they make up almost 20% of the global poor. We know that the cultures and languages of Indigenous peoples are responsible for much of the cultural diversity that exists, including 5,000 distinct cultures and 4,000 languages. And we know that the languages, the knowledges, and values of Indigenous communities are embedded in the land and seascapes within territories that cover approximately 24% of the land worldwide and host 80% of the world's biodiversity. So many of the world's healthiest ecosystems are managed by Indigenous communities whose governance systems, values, and traditions often support biocultural diversity and promote environmental stewardship. We heard a little bit about that from Jorge. There are a range of global and national protections for Indigenous peoples. At the global level, we have, of course, the ILO Convention 169, which safeguards the application of the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. We also have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which outlines minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. And so what we have within that declaration, protections from assimilation and discrimination, and protections from forced removals from traditionally owned lands. It includes rights to self-government, to participate and consent to any decisions which affect these communities, and to control and also to have returned traditionally owned lands and natural resources. And it generally enables Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, and that means to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And as we've heard from Katrine, the human right to science and to scientific knowledge that supports these capabilities and rights and aspirations are critical for Indigenous communities themselves and their survival, the biodiversity and ecosystems that they steward, and our global planetary futures too. But of course, Indigenous communities are vulnerable to oppression, and there's a few interconnected vulnerabilities that I've talked about. One is socioeconomic, making up almost 20% of the global poor. So there's poverty, the location of Indigenous communities on resource-rich lands, and Indigenous knowledge and practices that privilege stewardship rather than extractivist approaches to development. So in a recent article published in the most recent issue of Science Advances by Arnim Schneidel with a number of collaborators, including Indigenous scholars, examines environmental conflicts and their impact on Indigenous communities. And the authors usefully highlight the way in which Indigenous stewardship practices will, on the one hand, offer key solutions to mitigate things like climate change and support transformative change globally. On the other hand, one of the ways in which these communities do this is precisely by protecting their territories from extractive and other kinds of development pressures. And so they remain extremely vulnerable in the face of development projects. And of course, this is often coupled with a lack of recognition of their existence, dismissal of rights and claims, so land dispossession, various forms of violence and intimidation, a loss of their livelihood. So many Indigenous communities have been or continue to be driven from their homelands to urban centres, for instance, widespread environmental destruction, but also the undermining of the credibility of Indigenous knowledge systems and practices relating to the environment. And that's undermining the credibility of Indigenous knowledge as relevant to or as science, and undermining the credibility of scientists and science, Indigenous scientists and their allies. And so this occurs directly within particular communities because there's vested interests in development projects that cause the environmental destruction. So industry and government silence scientists that provide details of that destruction or make it difficult for any data to be obtained about these projects. And this happens across the world. And Indigenous communities remain most vulnerable to environmental destruction, biodiversity and climate injustices, for instance. And this occurs in communities from the Arctic to the Pacific, who are at the forefront of struggles to protect their territories and the planet. And so environmental scientists are vital for helping us to understand the extent of this environmental destruction, but also for transforming our development goals and practices. So any attacks on scientists attempting to protect the environment from that destruction are, in one way or another, attacks on these communities to the extent that it will affect their survival. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Dr. Watine. It's very interesting, all the topics that we keep addressing, and in particular, it's very dear to me, all that you said regarding the difficulties and the vulnerabilities and the poverty that all these indigenous communities face. And on the other hand, all the good work that they do in protecting and stewardshiping, the environment and the resources that are so important to all humanity. So we look forward to addressing a little bit more those issues with you in the discussions. So we will hear now from Professor Eugenie Rodriguez, a sociologist from Venezuela, currently affiliated with the University of East Anglia in the UK. With her expertise in local environmental knowledge and conflict transformation in Latin America, she utilizes participatory action research. Having worked in various Latin American countries, Professor Rodriguez focuses on local history, power dynamics, environmental justice, and intercultural dialogue. Professor Rodriguez will discuss the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean, where threats towards scientists and research organizations are particularly prevalent. Her presentation will shed light on the challenges faced in this region and in their impact on the pursuit of environmental sciences. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you very much for the previous speakers. I've really enjoyed all the presentations and completely agree with what has been said so far. My presentation is going to be based not really only in Latin America. I am talking in representation of a group of researchers that form part of a project funded by ISS some years back. It's called the Academic and Activist Co-Production of Knowledge for Environmental Justice. This was a collective of researchers from different parts of the world who in 2018, we set out the challenge to develop a project, an international research project that would help to do research on how transformations to sustainability are being shaped by resistance movements, by environmental justice mobilizations, with the hypothesis that transformations to sustainability do not only take shape through actions directed from the top, from the government, or governance structures that are set up by market forces. It's also by social mobilizations and resistance that largely change takes place. Now, this is really very important to bring into the conversation in this panel, because although we're talking about violence in different forms being expressed or exercised over scientists and indigenous peoples, among other actors, what is really important is that the silencing of environmental justice activists and actors and scientists is not only a direct impact on them as individuals, or us as individuals potentially, is the silencing of thinking of alternative futures for the world and for humanity. And this is what I find particularly disconcerting and worrying about the increasing trend of silencing science and indigenous peoples in their struggles against environmental destruction, because this silencing has a very specific purpose, which is the perpetuation or the expansion of a particular model of development. And this is what I think should also be part of this conversation, because the strategies that have to be developed to counteract these forms of violence have to really take into account how this global sort of capitalist system is expanding and the mechanisms that are being used to silence the expansion of the system. So the reason why I decided to speak more in relation to the Acknowledge project is precisely because when we started doing this project in 2018, what we wanted to capture was how transformations to sustainability were being shaped from the bottom up through social mobilization, precisely saying that by resistance, by confronting power relations, change can